at the muscle and nerve physiology that contribute and control to human movement. That's what we're starting with this week. All right? And again, if we're going to start with the physiology or how these systems work, we've got to first understand how the systems are put together. Again, the microanatomy, the components of that system. Because we know all of our movement, human movement, is initiated and controlled through these systems. Both in the anatomy, how we're put together, and the physiology, how we function, okay, how these systems work. So that's what we're starting with here. And it's really, what we're trying to do is make sure you've got that basic understanding of the neural system, the components of the neural system, the anatomy of the neural system, and how it works, and how that's going to affect the kinesiology, the kinesiological aspects of human movement. Okay? So that's really what our goal is for this week's material. So we know that movement is executed and is controlled by the brain, and as we're going to learn in this chapter, it's not just the brain. All right? The brain has an extremely important role in coordinating and affecting movement. All right? And executing movement, but also the brain is sending out information and receiving information regarding movement. We know that. And the brain serves a role in adjusting movement in response to the feedback that it's getting. Okay? And we know that there are two basic systems that we're dealing with. The afferent nervous system and the efferent nervous system. Okay? The afferent gathers incoming information from the periphery, from the sensory system. And the efferent nervous system sends responses out to our muscles. Okay? I don't know about you, but sometimes people can get confused about which is which. Think of cause and effect, right? Effect is when we're actually trying to create something happening, right? So that really is our motor response, is sending information out. Afferent is incoming. And you can choose to remember it however you want. But that's what always helps me. Well, if I start to get confused by afferent, efferent, if you start to get confused. Okay? So we've got information that's coming into the brain, and we've got information that's going out from the brain. More specifically, the central nervous system. All right, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. If we look, when we're talking about the groundwork, again, we're talking about the basic components, our basic understanding of this afferent and efferent nervous system. Number one, when we're talking about how this information is transmitted, it's through nerve impulses, incoming and outgoing nerve impulses. Well, what is a nerve impulse? What is happening? Again, this should be a review for you. First of all, everybody knows that what's the basic cell within the nervous system? What do we call that? The neuron, right? We know that that nerve cell, we talk about a potential difference in terms of charge. That difference is created by ions. What is an ion? An atom is a molecule or a particle with a charge, right? It's either got a positive or a negative charge. You remember what the positive ion is referred to as? What's the term we use for that? Anybody remember?
Cation.
Cation. And what's the negative ion?
Anion.
Anion, right. So we have cations and anions. Okay? And again, if you had trouble remembering the two, cat has a T, the T looks like a plus. So the opposites have to be an anion. Anion has an N, negative. Right? If you have trouble, you get confused with that. It's a good little mnemonic to remember it. The resting potential of any nerve cell exists because there's a difference in the concentration of charges inside and outside of the cell, across the cell membrane. All right? The decrease of charges, the difference in charges, rather, excuse me. There tend to be more positive ions or cations outside of the nerve cell, outside of the cell membrane, than there is on the inside of the nerve cell, the neuron, within the cell membrane. Okay? Greater concentration of positive ions inside versus outside. Okay? We know when there's more concentration concentration of something here versus here, if I have a greater concentration of anything in my left hand than I do in my right hand, where is energy going to tend to flow? From my left hand to my right, from greater concentration to lower concentration. That's true of heat. That's true of electrical charges. So when there's a greater concentration of one versus the other, there's going to tend to be a flow from greater concentration to lower concentration. In addition to a greater number of cations or positive ions outside of the cell, there is a fairly low, but a concentration of negative ions or anions within the cell. Okay? So that's going to contribute to that resting potential difference, making that inside of that cell more negative. Okay? Anybody remember what those primary ions are that we're looking at? I think I heard sodium, potassium, calcium, one more, chloride. Okay? Calcium and chloride have a negative charge. Sodium and potassium have a positive charge. They're cations. All right? So those are the four main ions that we're talking about. Two positive and two negative. Sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride. Calcium and chloride tend to have a concentration within the nerve cell. Sodium, potassium have a greater concentration outside of the nerve cell. Okay, that's what gives us that resting potential, that difference in charge. What's another term that we sometimes hear to describe those ions, sodium, potassium, calcium? Electrolytes, exactly. Electrolytes. So what are we talking about when we talk about if somebody has a deficiency in electrolytes, right? What does that suggest to us? What do you think? You say, well, we need more electrolytes.
Give them salt.
Well, you might think give them salt, right? But we're talking about replacing those electrolytes, right? We need to increase the concentration of electrolytes. Well, what does that suggest to us? We're not doing it for the heck of it, right? Keep this in mind when we start talking about muscle next week. That electrolyte concentration can affect the ability of a nerve impulse to travel. Okay, so if we're disturbing the concentration of these ions that are present inside and outside of the cell, it's going to affect the irritability of that cell, of that neuron, or its ability to react, its ability to be depolarized, its ability to change polarity, and meaning the ability for a nerve impulse to travel. So if it's difficult to cause that depolarization of the cell, that's what happens. We change the polarity of that cell membrane. It triggers a process of an action potential now traveling down from that cell down a axon. Okay, the nerve impulse. And if our electrolytes are out of balance, if we have insufficient or excessive amounts of electrolyte, which is not something we often talk about, then it can affect the irritability of a cell. It can affect nerve impulse, the ability of the nerve impulse to travel through the nervous system. So we're not just saying, oh, we need to give you more electrolytes because we have some lab value that's off. It has a physiological effect on the human body. What do we call it when what's the term that we ascribe to someone having an excessive amount of sodium in their blood? Anybody know? Hypernatremia, right? What's the chemical symbol for sodium? Na, right? Hypernatremia. What's the chemical symbol for potassium? K. What do we call it when someone has too much calcium in their blood? Anybody know? Hyperkalemia. K for potassium, hyperkalemia. So if there's not enough calcium, that would be what? Potassium. Hypokalemia, not enough sodium, hyponatremia, right? So, why are we saying this? Remember, our whole focus in this course and our whole focus in your education, you're not just, and this is not any kind of knock against personal trainers, that's not what I'm saying. You're doing more than personal training. We have to understand how certain medical conditions are going to affect what's going on with our patients. So if we were to see a patient and we see a report of their blood work that says they are hypernatremic, we need to know what that means. It means they have an excess amount of calcium, sodium in their blood. We have to understand that may increase what? Increase amount of sodium in their blood. What might that mean?
Blood pressure increases.
Yeah, blood pressure will increase, right? We might see a response in terms of their blood pressure, their resting blood pressure. But how about in terms of this, the physiology of nerve impulse transmission? A lot of sodium or a lot of calcium, either one. Remember, we said the difference in electrical potential outside the cell versus inside, right? There's a normal resting potential, a normal distribution of those ions. Yeah, Casey.
So I would assume that the ability of the cell to react would be much more diminished.
So it would be a less irritable nerve cell, right? Irritability is the ability of that cell to react, because you're going to have a much higher concentration of cations outside of the nerve cell than inside. The resting potential is going to be much greater. It's going to be harder to depolarize that nerve. Okay, keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that more. Okay, if there's an increase in potential, if there's an increase in calcium, I keep saying calcium, an increase in potassium, we call that hyperkalemia. If there's an increase in the polarity of the cell, what do you think we call it? Hyperpolarity, hyperpolarization. It's harder to depolarize that cell. If it's easier to depolarize that cell, meaning maybe it's occurring too easily, the cell is extremely irritable, easy to depolarize, what would we call that? Hypopolarization. So there's not enough of a difference in the electrical charge, right? And all of that is related to, well, how much sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride do we have in our system? It affects the physiology of that nerve cell. Yeah.
Early in the morning.
Early in the morning, yes.
Yes. Hyperpolarity is harder to get the cell to depolarize.
Right, because if you've got this concentration, right, you've got negative ions and positive ions, it's very easy to flip the polarity if the concentration not too great one way or the other, right? If the number or the concentration of negative ions is very low, it doesn't take much to depolarize that cell. If the concentration of cations or positive ions is very high, we've got to do a lot to depolarize that cell. So it's hyperpolarized, which would make the cell less irritable. It's harder to cause that depolarization. Yeah.
So when you say irritability, do you mean like the cell's ability to depolarize?
Yes. Yes.
If somebody's with low electrolytes, it means like their irritability, or they won't be able to depolarize the cell.
Okay. Again, it depends on the concentration of the ions. The likelihood is that there is going to be a more irritable cell, right? So they may tend to react more easily, right? With low electrolyte concentration, right? Now we haven't talked about muscle yet, because muscle responds a little differently than the nerve, right? We're just talking about polarization, okay? Okay, and again, that term for the depolarization of the cell and that institution of that nerve impulse is the action potential. If we depolarize that cell, we have the potential to cause a transmission of that neural impulse down the nerve cell, from the nerve cell down the axon. So that's depolarization. Repolarization is when we return to that normal resting potential. We depolarize the cell, ions flow into the cell. Repolarization, ions flow out of the cell, and we return to our normal resting potential. normal concentration of ions inside and outside of that cell. Inside of the cell membrane and outside the cell membrane. Okay? And again, we said, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Are we defining a number to the normal resting potential, or, because I know sometimes
There are normals, yes, we're not getting that far into it. We're not really getting that heavily into the electrophysiology. We want to understand conceptually what's happening. Okay? There are normal values for this, okay, and it's measured in microvolts. We're not going to get into that. Actually, millivolts, excuse me, millivolts, not microvolts. We're not really going to get into that. I don't expect you to know that necessarily. You have to know conceptually what's going on. So repolarization is that return to that resting potential. We've already said hyperpolarization is when there is a more negative potential. When we say negative, we're talking about inside of the cell. If there's a higher positive concentration outside the cell, that means there is a relatively low negative, increased negative potential across that cell membrane. It's harder to polarize that cell. Okay? Neurotransmitters are the substances that we talk about that will cross that cell membrane. And they're present at synapses, connections between cell membranes, between neural cells, rather, neurons. Okay? So the neurotransmitters are the actual chemical substances that cause this nerve impulse to travel, cause it to be transmitted from one nerve cell to another. All right? Again, we'll look at that in more detail in a bit. We can look at our nervous system and classify it both physiologically and anatomically. How does it function and how is it structured? Okay, we're looking at it from two different perspectives. Physiologically, we have a somatic nervous system and a visceral nervous system. What does soma mean? Body. So we're referring more to our muscles and our skin, the external functions of the nervous system, external components of the nervous system, muscles and skin. That's the somatic nervous system. Our visceral nervous system, what does viscera generally stand to mean? Organs, specifically the internal organs. Because the skin is an organ, right? But it's an external organ, right? We're referring primarily to the internal organs. Our heart, lungs, and kidneys, and stomach, etc. Liver. So the visceral nervous system, we actually describe, there are two different categories of our visceral nervous system, which we also call our autonomic nervous system. What's our other physiological difference between these nervous systems? We talked about the autonomic and what? Muscles and skin. Okay, do my muscles just contract on their own? Sometimes, yes. Right, sometimes they do. But if I want to move, I have to send an impulse from my brain to my muscles and cause that muscle to contract. I have to send a nerve impulse, right? Voluntary, right. So you're voluntary and autonomic. And autonomic sounds like automatic. We don't voluntarily control the autonomic nervous system. However, I think we all know there are people who can voluntarily decrease or increase their heart rate, right? So they have the ability to control their autonomic nervous system. It's unusual, it's not rare, it's unusual, but they are able to use impulses from the brain to affect that autonomic nervous system. By and large, we can't control that, right? We can't voluntarily determine peristalsis within our digestive system. I'm going to slow down how fast food is moving through my digestive system. That's pretty unusual, all right? But it's pretty well documented that we can voluntarily raise or lower our heart rate and possibly our respirations, right? That's not that unusual. But still, we're breaking up between the somatic and the visceral, the autonomic and the voluntary nervous system. And within that autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, nerve tracts. Which does what? Sympathetic tends to do what? Parasympathetic tends to do what?
Right. Sympathetic is fight or flight.
Say it again?
Fight or,
The fight or flight.
and then the other one is rest.
And simply put, sympathetic tends to speed up activity, parasympathetic tends to slow down activity. That's the simple way to understand the difference. You know, the fight or flight, we have to make something happen, right? We're going to fight back or we're going to retreat, right? Fight or flight, you're going to increase, decrease. We're causing action, all right? Parasympathetic tends to slow activity down. There are drugs that affect the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. When we get into our pharmacology, which we're not going to do in this class, but when you get more into the pharmacology and how different drugs affect the human body, we've got to understand, well, this is a drug that tends to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. We might expect that may be one that tends to increase blood pressure, increase heart rate, right? If this is a drug that tends to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, we may see a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in blood pressure.
Is that something we get into in this program?
Not in this class. A little bit. You're going to deal with it more next semester, okay, in PT Procedures 4. You get into the pharmacology a little bit more, okay? So physiologically, functionally, what happens and how the nervous system causes activity within the body, that's one aspect. Anatomically, we know we can break down our nervous system into our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is essentially the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. The cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, afferent and efferent nerves that are traveling from and to the periphery, they are all part of the peripheral nervous system. So, L5 nerve root, is that central or peripheral nervous system? The L5 nerve root, or L4 nerve root, or T1 nerve root. Peripheral, because it's outside the spinal cord, right? It's connected, it's derived from, and escapes from the spinal cord, but is part of the peripheral nervous system, okay? So that's our main distinction between central and peripheral. And we know, and you've already talked about it, I'm sure in some of your classes, you'll talk about it a lot more this semester in your neuro class. When we see disorders of the central versus peripheral nervous system, we see differences in how they are manifested, what we see. Okay? Okay, our nerve fibers that are transmitting our nerve impulses. Motor and sensory fibers are wrapped in myelin. What is myelin? One word. Anytime you see an IN in a word, it means it's a protein. Okay? So what is actin? What is myosin? What is myelin? Protein. Okay. So anytime you see that, it's a protein. Why does that matter? If someone is lacking proteins, severely malnutritioned, okay, again, we have things that may affect the nervous system. All right? If someone is starving, what do they need in order to stay alive? Protein. They're not getting it from a food source. So where are they going to get it from? Their own body. So they're going to start breaking down proteins in the body. Okay? They may be breaking down muscle protein. They may be breaking down nerve protein. Okay? That's why this is important. Well, we also said that it's a protein. It acts as what in terms of functionally, when we have that myelin around the nerve, tends to act as a insulator, right? It is made of a phospholipid structure, which is a fatty structure, right? Lipid is fat. And it speeds conduction of the nerve impulse down the axon, down the nerve. Anybody remember how it does that? You've got it on your screen here. What are the nodes of Ranvier? What are they? Remember? Say it loud. So,
The gap between the myelin.
Gaps between myelin, right. So the nerve impulse, if we said that myelin acts as an insulator, right, nothing can travel through that myelin. So what it has to do is jump from one node to another. That speeds an impulse down the nerve by jumping from one node to another. Right? Yeah.
So myelin's a protein, is it a phospholipid or fat though?
Phospholipid is the chemical composition of the myelin. Okay? Proteins have different chemical compositions. Okay, so this is a protein that is comprised of phosphates and lipids. It's a phospholipid. Okay, it's a chemical composition of myelin. All right. So yeah, those interruptions in the myelin, we conduct that nerve impulse down that nerve, that axon. It can transmit much more quickly. So if somebody loses myelin, what does that tell you about the nerve impulse? It's going to slow it down, right? It's going to slow it down. So we're not going to have as active a transmission of that depolarization of that action potential down the nerve, right? Because we've lost myelin in that either that motor or sensory nerve. Okay, so if we lose myelin in a sensory nerve, what effect does that have on that person? Loss of myelin in a sensory nerve. How is that going to impact on them? What do you think?
Decreased sensation.
So decreased transmission of sensory information, right? Give me an example of how you might see that manifested in a patient.
Slow reaction times.
Slow reaction times. Okay, this surface is hot. I lose myelin. I can't tell right away. I don't get that sensation of heat as quickly as I should. Well, that could be a real problem, right? I can burn my skin without even realizing it, yes.
So with patients with neuropathy, is it usually because of the lack of myelin?
Not necessarily, no. That's a very general term. Peripheral neuropathy or neuropathy means a disease process occurring in a nerve. Okay, exactly what is occurring depends on, well, what disease are we talking about, right? So there's lots of diseases that can affect nerve conduction velocity, which is what we're talking about, NCV. All right, and it can affect that in many ways. Loss of myelin is one thing that can happen to a nerve. Okay, a decrease in our ability to produce neurotransmitters. Right, you can't produce adequate amounts or concentration of neurotransmitters. Well, that can affect transmission of a nerve impulse too, but that's at the level of the synapse. All right. So neuropathy just means a disease process is occurring in the nervous system, neuro disease. Peripheral neuropathy is occurring specifically in a peripheral nerve or in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that's a general term. Again, we talked about our afferent and efferent nervous system. Sensory nerves sending information from the periphery, those are our afferent nerves. Nerves that are sending information to the periphery, to the skin and the muscle, are efferent nerves. They are motor nerves. Okay? So our sensory nerves are afferent, our motor nerves are efferent. Okay? And we've already said those autonomic nerves are primarily concerned with involuntary impulses, involuntary activities, such as peristalsis through the digestive system. We've already said, yes, heart rate and blood pressure are primarily involuntary, but some people do have the ability to voluntarily control those things to a limited extent. Okay? Now again, looking at the micro level, we're classifying these different types of nerves, and we're classifying these systems, and now we're looking at them anatomically. Okay, we can classify these nerves according to their size in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, this is how we classify our nerves in the peripheral nervous system. The largest in diameter nerves are your type A. We can further divide them into subtypes of A alpha, A beta, and A gamma, and A delta. Okay, the Greek alphabet comes into big play here. All right. in general, we're talking about A, B, and C as our diameter, our largest diameter nerves. And as we go from A to B to C, the diameter tends to increase. Our type A and type B nerve fibers are myelinated. Our type C are unmyelinated. We have a larger diameter, we get a faster transmission of that nerve impulse. Okay? Think of a water pipe or a garden hose. A large garden hose is going to be able to carry a lot of water. A smaller garden hose is going to carry a lower volume of water. Same idea with our nerves here. We can carry we can have a much faster transmission with that larger diameter. Okay? So as we go from larger to smaller, the nerve conduction velocity decreases as we go from A to B to C. Okay? And again, in addition to that size, we've said type A and type B muscle fibers are myelinated. So that's going to speed that transmission even more. Our type C are unmyelinated. It tends to be a slower transmission. Okay? We can specifically classify our sensory nerves into two major categories, type 1 and type 2, or group 1 and group 2. You'll see both terms used, type 1 and group 1. The type 1A muscle fiber, nerve fiber rather, is associated with the muscle spindle, and the type 1B is associated with the Golgi tendon organ. These are sensory organs, right? That are either delivering or receiving sensory input. Okay? The group 2 muscle nerve fibers take impulses from those secondary fibers of the muscle spindle. Okay? So impulses from the muscle spindle, receiving information from the muscle spindle via these type 2 fibers. Okay? When we talk about muscle in more detail, we start looking at muscle physiology in more detail, we start talking, anybody hear the mnemonic, one slow red ox? Okay, keep that in mind. One slow red ox. We'll talk about it later. Okay? Don't worry about it, write it down. It's okay. It's just a mnemonic to help remember certain characteristics of our muscle and nerve physiology. And if we're looking at the motor nerves in the peripheral nervous system, we'll talk about it, don't worry. We look at our alpha motor neurons and our gamma motor neurons. The alpha motor neuron innervates the extrafusal muscle fibers, where the gamma motor neurons innervate intrafusal muscle fibers. We're going to look at muscle anatomy later on. Okay? Alpha are extrafusal muscle fibers, and gamma motor neurons are intrafusal muscle fibers. Again, we'll talk about this more. So that's on the peripheral nervous system. If we look at the anatomy of the central nervous system, which consists of what? Brain and spinal cord, right. Okay. So central nervous system is our brain and spinal cord. We see two types of nerve tissue within the central nervous system. The white matter and the gray matter. What makes that tissue, neural tissue, white is the presence of myelin, high concentration of myelin. That's why it appears white. Has anybody taken any gross anatomy class? Probably not. Oh, you have? Great. Have you actually looked at brain tissue? If you've even if you haven't looked at actual brain tissue, an actual physical specimen, not live specimen, a dead specimen, if you've looked at a cadaver specimen of brain tissue, or if you've seen any photos of brain tissue, you can discriminate between white matter and gray matter. Okay? So myelin is what's responsible for that white appearance of this tissue. It has a lot of fiber tracts, a lot of neural tracts in that tissue, and those neural tracts are myelinated, so you've got a lot of presence of white matter. Okay? And in the gray matter, there is not a lot of a high degree or high concentration of myelin. So relative to that white matter, you don't see a whole lot of myelin, so it appears more grayish in color. The central portion of our spinal cord is gray. The peripheral portion of the spinal cord is white. There's a higher nerve conduction velocity in the exterior or external or peripheral portions of the spinal cord than there is on the central portion. Okay? And this is true, again, in various areas within the central nervous system, including within the brain. We have white matter and gray matter present in the brain tissue itself. The neurons that are associated with these two areas of the nervous system, the central and peripheral, upper motor neurons are located within the central nervous system, so within the brain and spinal cord, and they carry impulses from the brain to the spinal cord, the upper motor neurons. Our lower motor neurons carry impulses from the spinal cord to the muscle fibers. Okay? So what type of fibers would these be? Carrying information from the spinal cord to the muscle fibers. Efferent. Right, efferent. Just want to make sure that we keep our terminology straight. Okay? So our upper and lower motor neurons, we know there are characteristics associated for those upper and lower motor neurons, which we'll look at on Wednesday. Now, if we've looked at our nervous system, both physiology and anatomy, microanatomy. So now we're going to look at the muscular system in a little more detail. Anatomy. If we look at the muscle itself and muscle fiber structure, the muscle itself is surrounded by an epimysium. Just like our skin consists of an epidermis, the outermost layer. Right? So the outermost tissue anatomically in the muscle is the epimysium. Okay, what does MY indicate to us? Muscle, right? Myo muscle, MY muscle. So the epimysium is that outermost fiber structure. The paramecium divides that particular muscle into different sections. So paramecium surrounds portions of one particular muscle. That's the paramecium. Each section of that muscle is comprised of muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is an individual muscle cell. So you've got millions of cells, millions of muscle cells, and millions of muscle fibers within a given muscle. Okay? Each muscle fiber is comprised of myofibers or myofibrils. Interchangeable term. Each one of those myofibers is covered by a sarcolemma. Excuse me, not sarcolemma. Sarcolemma. All right? Each myofiber is comprised of individual units called sarcomeres. All right? Each sarcomere is located between two Z-lines. A Z-line at each end of that sarcomere. Again, we're looking at the microanatomy of muscle. All right? If we look at the structure of these anatomical structures, the myofibers or myofilaments are composed of, we've already mentioned, actin and myosin. Actin tends to be a thicker molecular structure. Myosin tends to be thinner. I'm sorry, the other way around. Actin is a thinner anatomical structure, molecular structure. And myosin is a thicker myofilament. That actin helps to bind myosin. Okay? It actually helps to attach the myosin filaments to the actin. And each myosin filament has cross bridges at each end of it. Those cross bridges are where that myosin filament, myofilament, attaches to the actin filament. All because these structures are both thick and thin, when you actually look at a muscle, again, if you were to look at, in gross anatomy, actually look at actual human muscle, it will have a striated appearance or a striped appearance because of the difference in size of these different filaments that actually comprise the muscle itself. Again, if we look microscopically at these bands, at these muscle fibers, again, each one of these muscle fibers contains both actin and myosin. There's a middle zone of that fiber which we call the H band. That H band, again, remember, you've got these different filaments, actin and myosin, that are parallel to one another. If we look at microscopically that section of that muscle, where we see that H band is where we're only seeing myosin filaments. It's not overlapping with an actin filament. That's our H zone. It only contains myosin. That muscle also has what we call a light band or an isotropic or I band, I for isotropic. That region of this muscle cell contains only actin. Okay? And they are bisected, cut, crossed by a Z line. All right? So this is what we're talking about. Okay, this is our visual representation of what we're talking about. The A band contains just these thick myosin filaments. The I band consists of just these actin filaments. We're illustrating these cross bridges between the actin and myosin. Right? The Z line separates each end of this entire structure is the sarcomere. And there's a Z line at each end of it. All right? Now you can imagine, as you're looking at this, the illustration is usually, or the visual video illustration of this, is as the muscle contracts, these filaments are sliding over one another. The sarcomere shortens, so the Z lines get closer to one another. As the muscle relaxes, the Z lines spread further away from one another. All right? The amount of contraction, the amount of shortening of the sarcomere is extremely, extremely small. Okay? It's measured in micrometers. What's a micrometer? What unit of measure is that? Well, a meter, we know, is a unit of length, right? So what is a micrometer or micrometer? 1/1,000,000th of a meter, right? Okay? It's not millimeters, which is 1/1000. It's in micrometers or micrometers. So this is a tiny unit of length. So how do we get so much shortening? Because we've got millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, of these sarcomeres that are all shortening at the same time. Okay? And they're all in series. So it calls the overall shortening of that muscle, grossly. Shortening of the overall muscle length. Okay? So we understand that what happens at one sarcomere is going to have to be replicated through all of those sarcomeres in order to get complete shortening of that particular muscle. Okay, if we lose one or two sarcomeres, it's not going to tremendously affect our ability to shorten that muscle. If we lose thousands of sarcomeres, well, yeah, and we might affect the ability of that muscle to shorten. And again, this is what we see in some injuries, in some disease conditions, is the loss of sarcomeres. Both trauma and disease, whether it's congenital or acquired. So those sarcomeres only decrease from about 2.5 micrometers to about 1.5 micrometers, about 2.5 micrometers at rest. That's how long each sarcomere is, from Z line to Z line. It's only going to shorten by about 1 micrometer. And it may be able to increase about another 0.5 micrometer if it's stretched. So we can pull those Z lines apart up to generally about 0.5 micrometer, tiny amount of distance. So what happens if we push them beyond that limit? What's going to happen? We're going to disrupt that sarcomere. Okay? We're going to damage the sarcomere. So if a muscle is overstretched, what's happening microscopically is we are disrupting individual sarcomeres. And we may be disrupting thousands or millions of them. Depends on the muscle. How many sarcomeres are present. So we're causing, what's that term we use for that?
Micro tear?
Micro tear or microtrauma. Right. We're causing disruptions within the microscopic components of that muscle. Microtrauma, micro tear. Okay? One second. If we completely disrupt that muscle into two parts, we call that what? Okay, if we say damage to the individual sarcomere, yeah, we call it a tear. Let's be a little more clinical. Okay? If microtrauma is damage to the sarcomere, and complete disruption, macrotrauma. Right, macrotrauma. Okay? I want to try and be clinical. Somebody have a question? No? Yeah.
You want to disrupt the muscle growth, right? You're going to want to stretch it and tear it, micro tears.
Well, not necessarily. Okay, we're going to talk about that more, but there's actually some controversy about what actually happens when we're trying to give muscle a new length. Are we actually changing the tissue, or are we changing how the brain is controlling that muscle? It's not settled science. It's not settled science. When it comes to strengthening a muscle, even that tends to be a little controversial. What are we actually changing when we make a muscle stronger? When we make a muscle larger? That's not even totally settled science, but we'll talk about that more when we talk about strengthening. And what I mean by that, Chris, is that yes, if you're changing histologically, if you're changing the actual tissue, and you're increasing the length of that sarcomere at rest, we said we can stretch it about another half a micrometer. And if we're now creating a new resting length of 3 micrometers instead of 2.5, how is that occurring? Is it because we're actually stretching the sarcomere, or is it because we've convinced the body that that should be the resting length? Essentially decreasing the tone in that particular muscle. So the resting length is 3 micrometers instead of 2.5. Follow? You know, whether that change is occurring at the tissue level, or is it occurring in the central nervous system, and how we're controlling the resting length of that muscle. Kind of unsettled science, what is happening. Okay. During contraction, the overall length of a muscle will shorten by about 40% of its normal resting length. We're not talking about the sarcomere, we're talking about the overall muscle, that accumulation of all those sarcomeres. The A bands do not change in length if we go up to the microscopic level. The A bands do not change in length, the I bands become narrower, and the H zone is completely obliterated. Okay? There's complete overlap between the actin and myosin filaments. Okay? So that's what's happening at the microscopic level. At the macro level, the overall length of the muscle shortens up to about 40%, and this is what's happening at the micro level, microscopic level, tissue level. And again, we describe this whole model of muscle contraction as the sliding filament model. These actin and myosin filaments are sliding over one another. Okay, that's why we call it the sliding filament model. Okay? Let me just stop for 1 second here. Okay. Now that's what's happening physically, mechanically in the muscle. So what is causing this to happen chemically? Okay, what's causing this muscle to contract? What's causing this nerve impulse to be transmitted to the muscle? Each end plate of a neuron, of a nerve cell, contains acetylcholine, which we see abbreviated ACH. Okay? The nerve impulse that travels down the nerve to the end plate of that nerve causes a release of acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is, what's that term that we use to describe that particular substance? It's a neurotransmitter, right? So it causes a release of acetylcholine. It jumps that synapse and it interacts with the muscle membrane. This is the end plate of a nerve transmitting a nerve impulse to a muscle. Okay? The end plate of the nerve interacts with the muscle membrane. The acetylcholine interacts with that muscle membrane and depolarizes that muscle membrane. Okay? A change in polarity at the cell membrane of that muscle and creates an action potential. Once it's done that acetylcholine loses its charge. It's neutralized. Okay? So that's what's chemically occurring to cause a nerve impulse to depolarize the muscle and cause the muscle to contract. So if we have any disruption at that juncture between the end plate of the nerve and the muscle membrane, we have any disruption there, a physical disruption, like where we pull the end plate away from the muscle, well, we may have increased the amount of distance that's necessary for that acetylcholine to travel. We don't get a transmission of that acetylcholine to the muscle membrane. We don't get a depolarization of the muscle membrane. Or if we're lacking sufficient neurotransmitters, again, the nerve impulse travels down the neuron. Once it reaches the end plate, there's not enough neurotransmitter to cause depolarization of the muscle membrane. So there's different things that can affect the ability of a muscle to contract, which could be chemical or physical, right? In order for that neurotransmitter to cross the cell membrane, it does so through specific structures. Again, looking at the microanatomy of the muscle cell. This is how these impulses are traveling from the exterior to the interior of the muscle fiber. Okay? And it's through a system we refer to as the endoplasmic reticulum, which consists of two major systems, the transverse tubular system and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay? These are the channels by which these acetylcholine neurotransmitters travel across the cell membrane. Again, we're looking at the microanatomy. What's happening chemically is that myosin splits ATP, which is our energy source, and it causes those filaments to slide. The metabolism of ATP. Okay? ATP, you probably maybe remember from your A&P, that's our main energy source for muscle contraction. It's a necessary protein that has to be broken down, in order to cause these filaments to slide, in order to cause those cross bridges, okay, to slide across one another, which causes the muscle to shorten and creates tension in the muscle, additional increased tension, okay? When that occurs, as the muscle is contracted, we use calcium to maintain that contraction. As the amount of calcium diminishes, the muscle begins to relax. Okay? And there's actual pumping of that calcium back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is what's happening chemically within the muscle tissue, within the muscle cell itself. So, as calcium drops, the muscle relaxes. So what happens when a muscle fatigues? We're exhausting the amount of calcium within the tissue. It can't maintain that contraction, the muscle begins to relax. Right? So if somebody is deficient in calcium, what do you think you might see in that individual? Lots of things, by the way, but let's specifically look at muscle. They have a deficit of calcium. Yeah, let's look at just the muscular system. That's true. Yeah, we see that within the osseous system.
They're going to have a hard time initiating muscle contraction.
And or maintaining the contraction, right? They may fatigue more quickly. They're exhausting their supplies of calcium more quickly. So the muscle is relaxing more quickly. They're fatiguing more quickly, right? So again, this is why we in therapy, it's why we want to have some basic understanding of blood chemistry. We're looking at lab results. And again, we've already said, we see that someone is described as being hyperkalemic or hyponatremic, okay, or has a calcium deficiency. We can know, all these things might impact on neural transmission, might impact on muscular contraction, right? And what's one of the more important muscles in the human body? The heart. Absolutely. So now when we see our blood work, some of those electrolyte values are off, we know it's not just the ability for you to do elbow flexion. It's going to affect the heart's ability to pump, the heart's ability to contract. You're going to learn about that a lot more next semester. Okay? There's a metabolic effect of all these blood values. Okay? It's why it's important for us to have, again, a basic understanding of some of these blood values. Okay? How about one that we haven't talked about yet, just as an aside? Hemoglobin. What role does hemoglobin play in the human body? Carries oxygen, right? Okay. What kind of condition, or what kind of disease process, what's the term that we often give to a low hemoglobin? Anybody know? You've heard the term. Anemia, right, anemia, right? Anemia specifically relates to the amount of red blood cells, right? Well, hemoglobin is the protein in the blood that carries the oxygen within the red blood cell. So if we have a deficiency of red blood cells, we have a deficiency of oxygen carrying potential. What else can cause hemoglobin to drop? So the concentration of red blood cells, the percentage of hemoglobin in the blood, right? What else can cause hemoglobin to drop? It's real simple.
Exercise?
Well, yeah, even more basic than that. Iron, even more basic than that. So we're not talking about the concentrations of something within the blood. If somebody, in case you didn't know this, if somebody went into the ER, right, and I don't know, you know, the normal hemoglobin for a male is anywhere somewhere between 14 and 16, right?
Yeah, 12 to 16. Yeah.
Okay, depends on the reference value you're looking at, but generally up to about 16. Let's say somebody comes into the ER, they check their blood count, and their hemoglobin is 6. What's the first thing that they might think?
Internal bleeding.
Bleeding, right. So the actual volume of blood, yeah, that's going to affect how much hemoglobin you're seeing too, right? So it's not just the concentration within the blood, the actual volume of blood. That's going to affect how much hemoglobin and your oxygen carrying capability of your circulatory system. Yeah, so that's the first thing you're going to think when you see a dramatic and sudden decrease in hemoglobin, they're bleeding somewhere. The likelihood is they are bleeding. Okay. I'll tell you what, we're going to quit there, and we're going to pick up on type 1 when we come back on Wednesday. But yeah, Chris, you had a question?
Joe was saying internal bleeding, would that do?
Not just internal bleeding, it could be bleeding anywhere. A loss of blood volume.
But internal would cause it too.
Sure, yeah. It's not within the circulatory system. Now it's maybe within the abdominal cavity. You know, it's not within the circulatory system. It's escaped from the circulatory system. So it could be internal or external bleeding. Yeah, you had a question? No? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's quit there, and this is it. We're going to pick up on our muscle fiber types on Wednesday. All right. 10 o'clock downstairs. Any questions on any of that?
Like a shepherd's pie for those Irish. Hey. On some peas. Bunch of stuff. Still, nothing the Irish do is good.
Yeah, other than.
So when I was telling you, as bad as that duck was, I remember the waiter coming up to me, and I'm like, yeah, I'll try the duck. He's like, all right, you want potato? I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, what kind of potato? I'm like, what do you have potato? How many potatoes are there? He got so offended, he's like, we have 108 varieties of potatoes. I'm like, oh, I don't know, give me your best. I'm like, sorry, man.
Your best potatoes.
I insulted the
You're Ireland.
beer drinking, potato eating. Sorry.
Excuse me. My ancestors were pretty accurate.
Sorry about that. Did not know there's 108 varieties of potatoes. Yeah.
Yeah, there were over 4,000 species of potatoes there.
How long?
Something.
Is it really?
Yeah, I just looked it up. That's pretty wild.
How many, I haven't seen it yet. Somebody told me the documentary on mushrooms
Oh yeah, I just
is
watched that.
supposed to be phenomenal.
It's really good.
I gotta watch it.
It's really good. Yeah.
It's amazing kind of mushroom.
Yeah, I heard it's very good.
Definitely watch it.
Yeah.
What's it
The
called?
mushroom documentary?
Oh.
I
Netflix?
think it's that.
There's one on Netflix, yeah.
Okay.
Because I tell you, like my bucket list is to go truffle hunting.
Wow.
Yeah.
With the pig or the dog?
I don't care. I would prefer to go with the pig, but that's the bucket list. It's truffle hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Two things. Number one is an opera La Scala, and the second is truffle hunting. Truffle, I mean, was the first one? I want to see an opera in La Scala, which is Milan, the Italians. Yeah, that's one. Truffle hunting is two. Yeah. So now I don't have to go to Italy or France. Like you can truffle hunt in Oregon. So Oregon is starting to build like a big truffle community. But you're right, it's very dangerous because they hijack, they like steal people's dogs and pigs. Because it's like $10,000 a pound for a truffle. Like a good, like black truffle is $10,000 a pound.
Yeah, like an average truffle, like an average, like mutilated truffle you pull out of the ground is like $300 a pop.
Yeah,
That's
very expensive.
How do you grow it?
But so good though. Oh my God. Little truffle oil on your french fries. Yeah, I put truffle on my pizza. Oh, so good.
All this whole time I was thinking we were talking about like
Chocolate.
the magical kind of mushroom.
I don't know. Which I appreciate the segue, because for your patient that took the magic mushroom, or who had the TBI, how do we know what we do is working? I can't do it, please.
Psychedelic mushrooms, they don't have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know how they, I don't know if like do they make, is it like a true mushroom? Like for you, guys, let me take a step back. For your friends who have done mushrooms, like is it like a real mushroom that they like, they just like air dry?
Yep. It looks like a dry mushroom.
But it's a real mushroom like you just pick off like the fields in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, you get good ones in Vermont, not in Vermont, you don't get them there. Just kidding.
Because when I was camping up in New Hampshire, the amount of mushrooms I saw was incredible. I
Well, my buddy lives up in Vermont, and there's, obviously there's more cows there than there are people, and they're pretty proud of that, I think. But they go out, they get the fresh picks straight out there.
and they know
From the
which
cow.
ones,
From the cow, they know what they're doing.
and they know which mushroom to get stoned on.
Absolutely.
Oh, I thought that was like manufactured. I didn't realize it was like a real mushroom.
There are like hundreds of species of mushrooms.
Is that a picture?
Kind of like these are some small ones.
Wow, and they just know where to find them. They look like it. So my fear is like I'm the guy that eat like the one red berry. I'm hungry. I eat the one red berry and I'm dead.
Imagine being the first guy that found that out.
Yeah, it's a
You eat
good
the
point.
wrong mushroom and you start looking around, you're like, oh my God, this is not right.
Yeah. I was looking for
Clouds are talking.
I didn't find there was no portobellos up at the White Mountains. I'll tell you that. I was looking for those. Like, ooh, nice grilled portobello. Be a good meal. Better than my freeze-dried rice and beans.
Mascara on there.
You ever see Into the Wild?
I read the book.
True,
Yeah, sure, yeah.
They just pulled the bus out.
What's that?
They just choppered the bus out like a couple months ago.
Really?
Yeah, they took it out of the, like Alaska. They put it in the museum. People kept getting lost trying to go find it.
Right, right, and then they end up like that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did he eat, berries, I think it was, or
Yeah.
something? Yeah. Didn't know.
Yeah, it was that and the lack of fluid or
Protein.
drinking, yeah. The hay he was eating, something like that. Anyway, here we go. So here we go, this lecture, it's not gonna be on any tests. I always talk about motor control, motor learning, but I find it's like important to realize, like, what we do, and like, how do we ensure the patient is, learning to be able to develop, the function, the control. So there's a lot of things we talk about with the motor control, and if you get really deep into it, and you've taken other courses like undergrad, like maybe kinesiology, XPhys, there might be some other courses that would teach you about the motor control of, like practice. Is it block or random practice? Whole task to part task, meaning if we talk about land, we'll do it with the other guys. If I want to do sit to stand, do I just have the patient stand up, sit down, stand up, or do I break it down? Again, there's research that can show one's better than the other. I think it all depends on the patient you have, how they learn, what they're capable of doing, and the extent of their diagnosis of the injury. So basically, the definition, skills and abilities that are learned and acquired during development. So you take the pediatric population, they just keep doing it. They're gonna make, if you watch kids as they develop, you see them make mistakes. They're gonna fall over, wide base, all that type of stuff. But they develop, they learn from there. Same with us, it's okay for our patients to make mistakes. And we'll get into that knowledge of results, whereas, do you teach the patient or do you cue them through the entire process? Or do you let them make mistakes and have them figure out what they did wrong? So you have that knowledge of performance, knowledge of results. So again, is it easier for me just to guide them through standing the whole time? Or have them do it, let them fall back and say, well, what did you do wrong? Like, what do you think you can improve on? So again, it allows our systems to adapt to changing demands and environment. So it's always changing. Again, with our population, that's changing each time. Maybe they become more forgetful, dementia gets worse. So how do we evolve? How do we change so we know what our goals are for this patient, we're going to be able to achieve them. So motor control, the ability to maintain, change postures, and movements. To go from walking on a flat surface to walking outdoors, walking through a lit hallway compared to walking when it's darker. Change of environment, a hill, something unsteady. So how does the body control that? Going from a seat to the physio ball, how does the body control that? Complex process using neurological, mechanical processes, and so part of it is the nervous system directing what muscles need to be used, when they need to be used, and then again, the proper firing of those muscles to get them to work. Really developing that problem, that process. So the movements occur in fractions of seconds. So those with neurological disease, even those with orthopedic musculoskeletal diseases, if those muscles don't fire properly, if they're slower, you're going to get improper movement, possible falls, again, breakdown in movement. So all our patients are going to have some type of impairment that's going to affect that motor control, that postural control. So the sensory input, we have touch, contact with the surfaces. Our feet on the ground, senses where, the type of surface, what needs to be changed. Somebody walking on hardwood floor is going to be different than somebody walking on a rug. I don't know if you guys have ever, I guess they probably don't have that in like PT labs, certainly in the home we have it. But have you ever done that with somebody walking on, like say, a regular floor, then you move to a different surface? and the reaction, again, it's very different. In fact, I know with Dave, we were talking in the lab with some of the guys he has at Universal, where just a small change of surface can really affect the patient. So we'll get into that. It's big what we were talking about here. So you have your site, your position in space. A lot of times we use our vision to accommodate the lack of sensory input. But now we have a patient who has poor vision, how that's going to affect their walking or their movement. Sound, communication, what's around them, then also balance in that vestibular system. Controlling balance, again, being able to tell the brain where it is, what movements are occurring. And then the joints and muscles, the position in space and weight bearing. Kinesthetic, proprioceptive feedback. It feeds info into the brain, produces the motor output, and gets our movement response. So again, all those sensory input is very important. The last slide we're going to talk about, well, if I want to get my patient to move properly, what do I need to do? How do I break that down? So different theories, the hierarchy theory, it's top-down model from the cortex sending orders to the subcortical structures below. Your thought process generates the process, the thought, what do I want to do? And then the motor process, the motor planning of it, the motor, the mobility, the motor system then carries it out, performs the movement. But you need the nervous system to be able to send that info properly to what muscles need to be moved. If you look at somebody who has TBI, MS, different types of diseases, well, maybe that thought gets sent to the muscle, but it gets lost somewhere along the way. Like you look at Alzheimer's, I don't know if anybody has a family member with Alzheimer's or has treated somebody with Alzheimer's. They know what they want to do, but the brain doesn't send the signal. So the brain has no idea that you got to walk or you got to stand up. So it's almost like it forgets, the muscles forget how to react. It's not that the patient can't, well they can. It's not that they don't want to, they just don't know how to do it. It gets lost. So we developed this through infancy, through the assessment of reflexes, which is the basic motor unit. One of these we're going to stress, that we talk on a lot. So you learned your reflexes last year in pediatrics. Well, a lot of them you lose as you develop and grow. With our neurological population, those reflexes reemerge. You're going to see your ATNR. You're going to see your STNR, your tonic labyrinthine. And so these are reflexes that reemerge. So we really never lose them, but they reemerge with this neurological population. But now it becomes very important with treatment. How do I position this patient to avoid that reflex? Or how can I use that reflex to help me with function? And so again, we'll see a lot of that. And next week, Wednesday, we'll probably get into motor development. We'll touch on those reflexes as well. You guys remember ATNR?
Yes.
You guys still do it? Anybody see the ATNR in your daily life?
Yep.
Right? Whenever you yawn?
Every time Joe,
Well, yeah, right. You see it all the time.
every time Joe yawns in class.
Right? When you yawn, what do you do when you yawn? You're doing your ATNR.
Brian was pointing out to me earlier,
Yeah.
when a guy gets viciously knocked out, like in a boxing match or whatever, they might go into that, you know what I mean, when they fall, they're like doing this, and I never even think about it until,
Yeah.
I guess it just comes.
I mean, I was never in the environment of people getting viciously knocked out. But I appreciate your experience. I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, it's possible, absolutely. But you certainly, when you yawn, that's your ATNR. So we never lose those. They might, call us, say, go to sleep. But they reemerge with the neurological population. So for instance, what the STNR, what's that called? Symmetrical tonic, right? So what happens with that? If I flex my head, what happens to the upper extremity?
Oh, it does the opposite.
So it's going to extend. But what do my legs, what lower extremity do?
Flex.
They flex. So let's say we're working with an adult who has some neurological problem, and I want to work on trunk control, and I'm doing quadruped. And we're going to get into those positions. Quadruped, kneeling are awesome positions to work with your patients. Very challenging. You can get a lot out of it. And then we're going to get more into, hey, if I'm quadruped, if somebody has increased tone and I weight bear, I can minimize that tone. Well, that's what I want to do. Or if they have a flaccidity, by compressing the joint, approximating the joint, I can get those nerves to fire, possibly developing some muscle strength. So yeah, quadruped, great position. However, if I'm quadruped with that stroke patient, and I have them look up, what's going to happen? You're going to fall flat on their face. So that's one of the things you got to be careful with positioning with these neurological patients, is the emergence of these reflexes. So that's why we work a lot of it just neutral. And we'll get into that. But it's going to be important. If you have any time, go back and look at those reflexes. ATNR, STNR, tonic, loud, and thin. Plantar reflex, palmar grasp, right? If I want to stand a patient, somebody that's, you guys have seen at University have the standing frame, the tilt table. If I want to stand a patient, but I put some stimulus on the sole of their foot, on the plantar aspect of the foot, what's going to happen?
Verbinski?
Aren't they going to grasp? Are they going to curl up?
Oh,
They're going to curl under. Well, I don't want the toes to fire. I don't want that. I want to control that. And so therefore, I got to find, okay, what's going to be the best position, the best, what can I use to avoid those reflexes? Same thing with palmar. Put something in their hand, they're going to want to clasp it, right? Well, I don't think your chopper doesn't do that anymore. Right.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like voluntary now.
Yeah,
I think she's learning to
let go.
finally get.
Yeah. But I don't want to put anything in their palm, because that's going to create that palmar grasp. All right, so go back and look at your reflexes. So development of motor control, initial movement, followed by maintenance of posture. Then it becomes the movement within the posture, then moving from one posture to the other. Child lies prone first, or supine, they don't move. Then they start to develop the head control. Then they start to develop some trunk control, they go quadruped. Then they start to crawl. So they start with one basic posture, develop the control of that, move up to the next posture, develop that control, and now they can move. And so again, if you've seen infants, head control is first, then they can get on their hands and knees. Well, they got to sit first, but besides that, but even when they sit, they have to develop that trunk control. Then they can quadruped, then they crawl. Then they start doing some creeping, where they can start to stand, holding on to something, then they let go and they walk. So that's all development of that posture, that trunk control, the head control, shoulder control. Over time, that motor control to develop to get the skill, purposeful movements. And aren't we teaching skills? Hey, you know what? We want to make sure that you can get out of the chair safely. I know you had the TBI, the stroke, you have a hard time doing it. I know your left side is spastic, but we're going to come up with techniques that'll help you. We want them independent. Well, independent, it's not just normal what we do. Independent is them doing it on their own. I don't care if it's an assisted device. I don't care if there's other techniques that they need to do. I don't care if you have to use your chair and lift you up. If you can get out of that chair by yourself, you're independent. That's what I want you to get to. Not that I have to come in and lift you up. So ultimately, we're teaching the skill. Yeah.
So like, for example, stair training. If a patient is doing it completely against the book, everything's wrong, but that's the way they've been doing it for years, you're going to let them do that.
Absolutely. Friday afternoon, I had this one guy who's dementia, and he can't go down, he's weak, so we got him up the steps, and he doesn't have good control going down forward. And even I teach step 2. He's like, for years I've always done it going backwards. And I watched him do it. He's got 2 hands on the rail and he goes down backwards. It's not this, to me it's not the greatest way, but I have more faith with him doing that than I do trying to go the normal way. So if he's safe that way, it's what he's done for a couple of years, he's most comfortable doing it. I assessed it, like, all right, you're pretty good doing it. I'd rather see you do it that way than the way I hope that you would the normal way. So it's the same thing with gait. I've had many patients where, like say if they've had a right knee replacement, hip replacement, and you put the cane in the left, they're like, I can't do this. I have absolutely no control of my left arm. Never did. I was always so right-hand dominant. And so you watch them try to walk, and they're walking wrong with the cane. I'm like, all right. Normally I would say the cane goes left hand, but because it looks like you're worse with the left, we'll keep it in the right hand. But I want you to maintain that normal pattern. So it might not be the greatest for the hip or the knee, but at least they're getting the coordination. I feel that they're safer that way. So it doesn't matter. Like, we're not looking for perfect. We want to get them safe and however they can do it. That's most important. Right? Let's regain that function. Might not be the most appropriate way or the best way, but if it works for you and you're doing it on your own and you're safe, I'm good.
And it also depends on how quickly you assess how quickly they can learn a new skill. If it's going to be like an arduous process, then it might not be worth it.
It might not, you're right. And if they're forgetful, if they just, we don't say it to patients, but you guys have heard like motor morons.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to use that derogatorily, but there are people that can pick up a skill very quick. There are people that just can't. It's the way it is. But now when you throw in some type of illness, a stroke, TBI, whatever it may be, it makes it a lot harder. And so now, okay, what's the best way for me to teach this person to do it? Might be extreme, might be unconventional, but you know what? If it works, it works. Yeah, so I think what we're looking at, important. Mobility, so we need movement first. Then we need stability. Let's control that movement to a controlled mobility and then eventually skill. So again, before I can move and reach something, I need to be able to keep my core tight. I got to strengthen that. Oh, then I got to be able to move the arm. Oh, now I can reach for something and be safe doing it. So mobility, random movements within the available range of motion. Movements are erratic. They lack purpose. Stage 2, you start to develop stability. Ability to maintain steady position in a weight-bearing, anti-gravity posture. Static postural control, and then eventually you want to change positions. So in lab, what we did today, which we'll do with you guys, we have one movement. Hey, let's just sit. Well, how do I challenge myself sitting? Well, before I can move, I got to weight shift. And then I got to move a little bit out of that posture. And then I can reach, change it, static, dynamic. Same thing with walking. Before that person can walk, they got to be able to shift the weight. Then they got to shift the weight and take a step forward. But even before they do that, they need that control. They need head control. They need trunk control. They need control of their arms for swing, control of the pelvis to move. And so part of what you guys do to assess, and then what we'll do in the lab is, okay, how do I break that activity down, or what do I need to strengthen in order to get this person to walk? So again, that becomes the stability. What position will your patient tolerate? What position would produce the best results? So that's what we talk about. Supine prone first. Hey, that's pretty easy for this patient. You know what? Let's go to prone and elbows. Let's go to quadruped. Let's go to short kneeling, tall kneeling, half kneeling, plantar grade standing. There's your progression. I'll write it out for you guys. There's your progression. Hey, what exercise should I do next? I don't know. But I know he's doing pretty good prone. Let's go quadruped. And if I gotta stay there and support, who cares? My job, what we do. Control mobility, weight shifting within a posture. So you have proximal mobility. Now we're combining that with distal stability. And vice versa. I need proximal stability to get distal mobility. So we really need both. But that's more down the road. That's more, okay, you got good control, you have good balance, that motor plan is getting better, now we can challenge it. Now we can add outside of our limits of stability, where you're reaching for something. Also need to perform proximal stability to perform distal mobility. So work one, also work the other. Again, like with our patients, that's why it's important, find out what they do at home. So if I have a patient where, hey, you're doing some great, you can stand, I do some perturbation, wow, your balance is a lot better. Then they go home, and it's, well, I gotta reach into the refrigerator to get a little thing of milk. Well, now I gotta go outside my base of support. And now I have to carry something which is heavier, which is gonna change that whole center of gravity. And then I gotta bring it over to a table. So it's great that we did a lot of balance exercises like this, but did I make it functional? Or did I say to the patient, okay, you're gonna set something up. You're gonna grab the cones as if you're in the refrigerator. Grab, reach, and then bring it over there. Make it functional. Okay, what are you getting back to do? So stage 4, they learn the skill. Mature type of movement, so they're acquiring that movement over time. That's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to teach our patients. So postural control, the ability to maintain the alignment of the body relative to each other, relative to the environment. You guys sitting here, you got good postural control. I'm sure if I gave you all therapy balls, you'll feel it more than what you have now with the support of the chair. But over time, sitting on the therapy ball will be a lot easier. We have our riding reactions, orienting the head in space, keeping the eyes and the mouth horizontal. You guys remember that with kids? Put them on a therapy ball. You turn the ball one way, they go the other. It's no different with the adults. So you want to work that. Have the patient sit on a therapy ball. Move that ball and see how they move. I talked about in the class our other reactions. There's the postural reactions, right? You have your responses, your ankle strategy, your hip strategy, your stepping strategy, the suspensory strategy. Right? If you're in an elevator drops, what do you do? You drop down with it. You surf. We were at the beach on Saturday. Man, I guess there was a storm. Like Hurricane Nicholas was way out. Dude, the waves were enormous. There were some big time surfers out there. It's pretty wild.
They had like at the festival they had like a surf demonstration going on.
Yeah.
Competition too, the surfers.
I've never seen waves like this in the Jersey Shore. I mean, these things were.
I think of the jetty in Point Pleasant, they're forecasted at like 10 to 12.
They were. That's right. That's right where I was.
It was huge.
I saved the seagull.
You really?
I did.
Good man.
I did. A one-legged seagull was flying. A wave came, hit it. It was like tumbling in. So I don't want to go too far, but as the wave pulled it in, like I went to grab it, and the thing started to bite me. Bitch, I'm trying to help you. So I yelled my son, bring a towel down. I grabbed the towel, I run up, I put him up on top. Took about a half hour, and he flew away. Yeah. I'm like, son of a bitch, you're trying to bite me? I'm helping you, man. Yeah. But no one cared. You know, no one's like, hey, nice job. Put it on their business. Like, you idiot, that's one less seagull I gotta worry about. It's a one-legged seagull. Yeah, I got to.
Save the turtles and
I stopped the car on the road and picked up a turtle to cross it, yeah. Yeah.
Wonder if it made it through the weekend.
Probably not.
Bought him a few hours.
Hey, you know, it's great, you saved the seagull, but you got carried up in the undertow and swept away. Thank you.
He's so bad.
I'm dying for you. Anyway, so posture control. In order to really get that, maintain that control, we need that riding reaction. Being able to shift the body to keep ourselves upright. So we can work that with our patients in the physio ball. You're there, so they're safe. Move that ball. Challenge that riding reaction. You also have the protective reactions, extremity movements that occur in response to rapid displacements of the body. Telling me in lab, I had a guy who had peripheral neuropathies from chemotherapy. And again, his balance was decent, But his problem was when he would try to walk or if he would fall, he couldn't catch himself. So I put a mat out on the floor, I stood behind him, and I pushed him pretty hard, hoping that he would take that stepping, use the stepping strategy. But we trained it, we practiced it, so we did that. Hey, 3 times 10. I'd push him and he'd step. He knew it was coming, but it would be like, okay, prepare, like, use your mind, really focus, picture you doing this. Step forward, hoping that that would be the carryover, that if he was walking at home, something were to happen, he would catch himself. Equilibrium reactions allows the body to adapt to slow changes in relation to the center of gravity with basic support. So again, very important, regardless of what your patient, what the diagnosis is, what problems they have, working these reactions, working that balance, working that postural control, very important. Any exercise that you want to do would be great. And not just, hey, we're going to strengthen the hip. Well, let's do some balance stuff as well, because that's going to be very helpful. So systems of motor control accomplished by the interaction of many systems, right? You need strength, you need the nerves to fire appropriately, you need the joints to know what's going on. You need the blood, the circulatory system to send it there. So you need all those. So it's a complex interaction with many systems. Again, through training, through maturation, the nervous response increases. The muscles get stronger. They fire when they need to fire, all with training. So we'll go back to your MMA days. When you first started training, you were a little slow, I would imagine, right? Get hit, then you learn, right? Yeah, then you pick up. Now all of a sudden, you're ducking away from that. And your body adapts to that. And it's through training. It's through what we do. Standing, we develop that mastery over gravity. Walking basically separates us from primates. Standing upright, being able to, unless you had that one bear, like you saw the video of the bear that actually walked.
Yeah.
I think they shot him, but maybe he didn't walk.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe if he was down on fours, he would have survived. But
Didn't show me.
because he was up tall, they shot him.
This isn't right.
It's not.
It's a threat to the humans.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be walking.
So we have our feedback. Feedback, it allows us to know what we're doing. The body, internally in the body, hey, what we're doing, is that right? So the closed loop, information used as feedback to provide assist with the next action. It's the correction throughout. So again, you have your patient walking, and let's say they're dragging their foot, and they might fall. Well, what do you think that feedback would be?
Gotta bring that knee down.
Let's lift that foot up.
Yeah.
Lift that foot up. So again, do I teach them how to do it, or to say, okay, feel it, like what do you think you're doing wrong? And in the open loop, the movement occurs without feedback. Correct errors after the movement. So you tell me how it was. How do you think you did walking? Like, well, I felt like my right leg was dragging behind. Okay. Well, walk again. Now take into mind what you felt. Maybe you had to lift the leg up. Maybe you had to stand upright, stuff like that. So we've been doing it. You've been doing it on your affiliation. You've been providing that feedback. You've been incorporating that motor control, motor learning. Just never knew what it was. We do it ourselves on a daily basis. And it's sort of what we do with our patients. So the components of the posture control system, the interaction between posture and movements. We need to be ready to move. We need to be able to react to those threats of balance. But we also need to anticipate what's going to happen. So it's very easy for us. You walk in the hallway, it's busy, somebody bumps into you. Whether you know it's going to occur, or if it does occur, you're quick to move. And that's why it's important with a lot of these patients to get them in different environments. Purposely have somebody walk into them while you're training them. See what they do. Do they anticipate somebody's coming our way? Do they react after they're bumped into? So our components of posture are limits of stability, the boundaries of the basic support. So we're going to see, eventually we'll get to like the functional reach, how far can that person go before they fall forward? So maintaining, again, what's balance? Well, it's maintaining the center of gravity within the base of support. But if I have somebody that has reach a short distance and they fall, well, you know what, let's train that. Let's go a little further. That's the, yeah, reach with your hand. Reach, touch mine, reach, come on. Right? And you're gonna see different strategies, but hey, I'm here. I don't get a nosebleed there.
Yeah, right.
Again, reach, change it up. Put them to the extreme. How far do you want to go? You're going to see stuff like this. I gotcha. Go a little further and train that. Environmental adaptations, input that allows movement to adapt to the current conditions. When you guys walk, run, and you go up a hill, what do?
Lean forward,
You lean forward. Why do you lean forward?
so I don't pull back.
Right? You're not going to walk up a hill like this. You're going to tumble backwards. You know, your body knows that I better lean forward because that's what's going to allow me to go up the hill, go down the hill. Maybe you take shorter strides. Again, because that's the adaptation. You train. You're aware what the body needs to do. Musculoskeletal system, postural alignment, musculoskeletal flexibility of all the body systems, again, allows us to work, to move properly, to have the strength, to have the proper movement in the joints. I have a guy now who his hips are fused. Not, surgically, they're just fused. And he wants to stand. And I'm like trying to figure out, like, I have no idea how I'm going to stand you. Because even a Hoyer lift, we have a Hoyer lift there. I'm like, even with a Hoyer lift, you're going to fall out. I'm just perplexed. How do I get this guy to stand? And he's like, there is no movement. He's like stiff as a board. Ankylosing spondylosis, other stuff as well. Yeah. But on top of that, just COPD, the guy's a mess. Great guy. But I'm like, he's like, I just want to stand. I'm like, ooh, all right. I'm thinking, how do I do it?
Standard, at least. Send him to UI. Put him in the standard.
I can't.
I know.
Because he has no movement.
So you can't even transfer him to get into a stand?
No.
Tilt table.
Yeah, a tilt table, that's what I would need.
Yeah, tilt table.
Yeah. But the guy's like stiff. No movement. No range of motion. Very, weak, but, he's been in bed for months.
How does he sit?
He doesn't. He lies in bed all day long.
And his range of motion is painful?
There's nothing.
It's
It's,
self-fused?
if he has 10 degrees of hip flexion, it's a lot. Yeah.
Why?
Can you just take like a hammer and just
Why do you use the hip?
hammer it in?
No, they didn't surgically fuse it. It just, it fused.
Calcified? Like,
Yeah, it just fused. This guy's condition. So I got probably a tilt table. But function, can't do anything. He's got no range of motion. I can't get it back. But with your patients that maybe they're just weak, or they're tight, from lying in bed, or they're sitting too long. And, hey, we want to stand, but your hamstrings are so tight that you can't extend the legs. Well, you know what? What am I going to do? What am I going to add to that treatment?
What kind of services do you provide to him if you can't sit or stand?
I do a lot of breathing. I do bed mobility, a lot of rolling, and very little ankle and knee range of motion, upper body stuff. So again, if I notice that, hey, our goal is to walk, and on my assessment I see, hey, you've been in the wheelchair for a while, your hamstrings are tight. What do I incorporate? Stretching. Because if I can't get those hamstrings, that flexibility back, what good is gait training going to be? He can't walk like this all day, right?
that's too much of a strain.
What's that?
It's too much of a strain.
It's
yeah.
it's not going to be effective. So yeah, my goal might be to get him to walk, but if I assess that his hamstrings are limited, I better stretch his hamstring. Let's try to get as much motion as we can. So all those components you have to consider. Predictive central set, being ready, being able to anticipate the movement. Hey, we're walking on regular regular surface. Now we're going outside. All right, a little bumpy. I'm aware. Okay, I know what I need to do. motor coordination, the ability of the nervous system to send that signal, to get to the muscle. The muscle needs to be able to fire appropriately. So this way I know that I can support it. So it's like going back to the quad set before somebody can start to do any other activity with the total knee. Well, you know what? I need to get that quad firing before I can really start progressing and engaging. And your eye-head stabilization, the visual system needs to be intact, the vestibular reflex needs to be working, and we're going to get deep into the vestibular system later on. But all that stuff needs to be intact. So if my patient is sitting in bed for a couple weeks, and all they're doing is staring at the TV or staring at the wall, now we finally get them up. And we do some walking. Before we do that, we're going to do some standing.
Definitely gonna be orthostatic on you, that's for sure.
They probably will. So you got to worry about your orthostatic hypotension. You know, before we walk, let's just stand. And we're going to stand for 1 minute. Good job. Hey, we're going to stand for 2 minutes. We're going to stand for 3 minutes. Build up the time there. But even before we get them walking, what can I do through standing? Weight shift. All right? Get some weight shift. What else? I'm looking at the reflexes here. What's that?
Marching.
So I can do marching, weight shift, now marching, now I gotta shift the weight, get 100% over. Certainly, reaching is dynamic balance, we'll do that in the lab. Even just turning the head. Because again, that's one of the reflexes. So if I change the surface, if I take their eyes out, they have to sense that. And what do we do when we walk? You walk in, you're looking at different things, so you're not just focused on one. You're looking to see what else is around you, what the environment is. So even just have them stand and turn their head side to side, up and down. Vestibular-ocular reflex, being telling the brain where it is, what's going on, so it can maintain that upright position. Okay, so it's sensory organization. We need our visual, our vestibular system, and our somatosensory system. Okay, eyes need to perceive what's going on. The vestibular, we need the brain to be able to know when it's changing, what position it's changing. And then somatosensory, the joint needs to know where it is statically and with movement, and we also need that sensory feedback. I need to feel the force. Again, going back to kids. First off, the worst thing you can do for a kid is give them shoes. It's the worst thing ever. Barefoot. Let them walk barefoot, actually their entire life. But obviously we can't.
Joe, you take notes?
I remember going, and I knew it, I remember going to Stride Right with my oldest daughter. Because the doctor's like, oh, you need Stride Right. There's great support for the kids. I'm thinking to myself, you know what? No. Like the kid needs to develop the arch of their foot, the sensation of their feet. It's how they're gonna interact, it's how they learn. Or it's like, oh, the doctor said, it's like you have the hardwood floor, I don't like it, splinters. It's amazing what you do with your first kid to your last. Like my son, I'm like, he's 8, we're going out for the weekend, just don't burn the house down, stuff like that, it's amazing. And so I'm like, listen, you don't need these shoes. Oh, the doctor said, go to Strider, it's like $60 for kids' shoes. I'm like, dude, she's getting sneakers better than me. And then all of a sudden, you put them on, they're walking around, then they take them off, and they don't want to touch the floor. They certainly don't want to go on the grass. I don't know if you've experienced that when you're doing it.
Not yet, no.
The grass is like the worst thing ever. It's like the most painful, even though it's not. Well, you know why? They don't have the sensory feel of that yet. So by not putting shoes on kids, they're going to learn and develop that sensory feedback. They're going to see what the different textures. One of the greatest toys, if you're buying a toy for a friend, take note, is the little thing that it's standing and it has sand and water and other things the kid can play with. Because the sand on their hands, different texture. The water, different texture. Like, other balls that have like felt and coarse, different texture. So it's amazing when you look at the toys that they have kids, there is a rationale, like a physiological rationale behind that toy and how it helps the kids develop. So there you go. When's the birthday?
Maybe the 25th.
You had to think about that, right?
Oh,
Really noted.
so we missed it.
Well, she's
Well, she was just born.
years old yet, so. Yeah.
Well, we got the 6 month coming up. This might be a big deal.
Oh, you're a cigar, I figure you. I'll remind everyone before you go on your affiliation. The big table that has like water so the kid can play with the boat, it has sand, but it's really good for sensory. So now think about our patients, our older patients who've been hospitalized bedbound. How about the patient who had an ankle fracture and has been casted for 6 weeks? Don't you want to do some sensory stimulation? Don't you want to massage the foot? Take a sock, a towel, and let me rub on the bottom of your foot. Let me put your bare foot down on the floor. Get that feedback. Because what's going to happen, they start walking, they have to go on different surfaces. They're not going to be able to accommodate to that. So that sensory feedback is very important.
So what about like toe walkers? Because theirs required to have
Yes.
shoes because they need to keep their foot in a neutral position. Or they want to
Yeah.
encourage that.
How about walking up an incline? That's gonna promote dorsiflexion for them.
Yeah, but they only know how to walk on
They only know how to walk on their toes. It's
They don't even
interesting.
put their foot
Yeah, you know
on
what's
the
interesting?
floor.
So I just finished treating this one woman who was like national ranked jiu-jitsu woman. And the daughter was also like black belt, high ranked for a young age. And the daughter was a toe walker. The mother had mentioned it. Like, yeah, she's this, toe walking. And I saw the daughter walk and she's a toe walker. But I wonder how that would be. So I don't know. I remember learning that toe walking was bad. Like now they're not saying it's as bad. Like you can still, doesn't mean, like I always thought toe walking meant you had some other neurological, like autism, some developmental type of problem. That's not the case anymore. Some
A lot
kids
of
just do
times
toe
what
walk.
they actually encourage for kids is, that sensory integration and input is really important.
Very important.
For
It's how we
walking,
develop.
But what they're doing is they're encouraging shoe wear because they're putting a heel lift in the shoe to encourage that,
Okay,
to flatten
makes
that foot.
sense.
So it's still at an incline,
Yeah.
but they want to make sure that they're
But
still
they're getting that
starting to come
sensory.
down.
Makes
Yeah.
sense.
So-
Wait, you put the heel in the front to kind of.
No, no, no.
So there's a little wedge.
Yeah,
that's
so
a
they're
heel lift,
like
but
toe
the-
walk, they're walking like this.
Yeah.
If my shoe has like a wedge, or if I put something in it, basically it's now the lift is what's touching the ground.
But that's encouraging it.
You're right. It's
But
keeping it
not as
shortened.
much of an incline. So when you're on your toes, you're like this.
Yeah.
But with the wedge, they're resting their foot on it. So they're still encouraging that toe walking,
Yeah.
but they're not like in that high of an incline.
So you're saying, and which is true, like,
Yeah.
well, it's keeping me in a shortened position,
Yeah.
but yet sensory-wise, I'm getting the feedback
Oh,
as opposed to if I'm toe walking
Got it.
and there's nothing touching the heel or the sole of your foot.
Got it.
Right? You guys see that? You've seen toe walkers?
Yeah.
So going back, I said that sensory input very important for balance, for proprioception. So you have that patient that was in a cast following an ankle fracture, do some sensory feedback type stuff. Different textures on the foot, rub back and forth, massage, range of motion, stuff like that. Very helpful. And then we got our postural strategy we talked about. Again, this is all stuff that we can teach. Our ankle strategy, our hip strategy, and then the stepping strategy. So again, we need that postural control. We need the ability of the body, the brain, to know what kind of movement it's going to be, for the muscles to work. But then the learning aspect of it, what we're really doing is bringing out that permanent change. Developing that patient, teaching them, practicing, so they can acquire that skill. So in motor learning, the process brings about permanent change in the motor performance as a result of practice or experience. The practice is just our treatment sessions. Hey, let's keep doing this 3 times 10. Eventually, they'll be able to do it. That's the functional stuff. But you also need the strength. So even if I'm looking for that person to be able to, hey, spike the volleyball the proper way, well, I got to develop the strength of it, that motor control, and then eventually that becomes a normal activity, and they can go back and do that again. So it takes place over milliseconds to month, depending on how difficult it is, the amount of practice and the feedback we provide, but also the motivation. Again, you're going to have patients that you teach them once how to gait train. They're going to pick it up right away. You're going to have other patients where it might take weeks for them to get it, and you get frustrated. Like, Jesus Christ, you're walking with a cane. Like, how hard can this be? Cane, step, but yet it's impossible for them. But other people, like right away. You know, again, it's like, how do you know to go from a walker, you're at the hospital with a patient who had a hip replacement, how do you know you can go from a walker to a cane? When can you do it? Yeah, when you're safe, I don't know.
Yeah, test
Let's
it
try
out.
it,
Yeah, try.
and let's see.
He's got the therapist with him, so
Yeah, exactly. I had a guy who came home from the hospital, the next day he got rid of everything. He was like walking normal with that. I go, all right, you're doing pretty good, you look safe. I would recommend the cane only to take some pressure so that pain. He's like, I don't care. I go, okay. See ya. You don't need me. Now, when you come. So our phase of motor learning, the cognitive phase. We need to teach them, learn, what does the task involve? If somebody has cognitive problems, how do I go about to do that? So that might be one of our biggest obstacles. How do I ensure that what I'm teaching this patient, they know what to do? Well, that might be through demonstration, that might be through video, that might be through different cards, home exercise, whatever it might be. But you have to figure that out with that patient. The associative phase associates the aspect of the task with success or failure. Each trial, well, you know what? You didn't do it right. Well, yeah, I can tell I plopped right back down. So it's okay for them to fail. But we're giving them that cue, that feedback throughout to try to teach them how to do it. How many times have you gone in and seen them sit to stand? Or even try to teach gait training? You go back the next time, it's like they forgot everything. And you go back again and you gotta reteach it. Well, you know what? That's gonna happen. You can't get frustrated. This person maybe doesn't learn the right way. What we have to do is figure out, what kind of learner is this? What's my approach? How am I going to ensure that this patient knows what I want them to do? Again, maybe some I write it down, maybe others I demonstrate, maybe others I have to give them cues and guide them through.
have them say it back to you.
Have them say it back to you. Again, everybody's different. You have your visual learners, your tactile learners. I know for me, I can sit in a lecture where you were, look at this stuff, and this stuff means absolutely nothing to me. Nothing. It's until I do it. And so in class, I would have, you know, a whole page of doodles, you know, whatever it was, you know, giant, you know, how many times can I do like a house with the X, you know, in a row, stuff like that. Because it meant nothing until I actually saw it. But then when I went to lab and saw it, like, aha, now I got it. And the autonomous phase, now it's become mastered. Can they carry it out? Where it just becomes normal movement. You guys get up and walk, no problem at all. You have that task mastered. But many years ago when you first started doing it, guaranteed you fell flat on your faces. Absolutely you did. You know, you drop down. And then you're looking for mom and dad, and then they run over, that's when you start crying.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you fall, you're like I'm good, but you know what? I need the reaction from mom. Oh my God, you fell. I'm like, any blood? No, you're good, get up. The first baseball game my wife took my son to, he got drilled in the head. Oh, forget it. Oh, yeah. And I'm like, did he get back up? Like, well, he sat an inning, but then he went back out there. I'm like, attaboy.
There it is.
Yeah.
Good job.
Right. He's like, I might take him to the hospital the next day. I'm like, what for? He's like, I don't know. He said he has a headache. I'm like, he's fine. She did. Took him to the doctor. I'll take him to the doctor. She's like, just so you know, you have an active son. You're going to be in here a lot. Yep. No blood, no fat. So again, we got to make sure they learn. How do I teach this person what I want them to do? Then I practice it. Eventually it becomes automatic. Then they know how to do it. Nice job. And they're happy too. Open skills done with the environment that changes over time. Closed skills, set parameters that stay the same. So what's better? If I want to get my patient to walk outside, do I start walking inside so they get better just walking? Or do I just take the patient outside right away and have them walk on an even surface? What do you think's better?
Take them outside.
Depends. I don't know. It depends.
Yeah, how functional? How functional is their gait now?
They're walking.
Where are they at?
It's part of the question. Don't get so deep into it. It's part of the question. No, but how do I know? I don't know. I don't know what's going to be better.
Yeah, what's the time? How are we doing? How long have they been there?
I don't know what's going to be better. They're both going to be better. But I do know that if that patient becomes pretty good walking on the surface, that doesn't mean he's going to be good walking outside. But if I can't get that patient to walk on the flat surface, how is he going to walk outside? You can think like that. I can just take him out and start walking on the uneven surface. Yeah, he'll get better. He'll get better both ways. So either way, whichever you want to do. I will say this, at some point, make sure you get your patient outside. Make sure you get them back to that challenging environment so I know that they can do it. So really what we do is practice. You know, can they transfer this skill? Keep on practicing. You know, what we used to do before the pandemic is I would have you guys do like a certain task. And we'd watch. Like you would videotape it. Like you pick like a family member, whatever. And, you know, some of the stuff was awesome. It was really fun. So we'd have you tell like your family member, friend, whatever it was, okay, I want you to do a task. Okay, say I'm going to shoot darts. And you see they're all over the place. They practice, and then like 5 weeks later, because it takes about 5 weeks to learn a skill, and then they see them and they're shooting darts. Some guy had his like old mom play the trumpet, it was hysterical. It was really great stuff. But that's the idea, is practice. How do I practice it? Do I just have them do it over time? Give them the feedback, well, your elbow's down, bring your elbow up here. Have them learn, well, geez, you know, I'm off the board. Well, let me move different, let me change my foot. And then all of a sudden they're getting closer. So again, that's what you guys have to figure out with each patient. What's going to be the best way? Do I always correct them? Or do I just keep my mouth shut, let them do it, and say, how do you think you did? Well, you know, it actually wasn't good. I feel I can control more. And let them figure out what changes need to be made. I can do it again. And then you can give that feedback. So practice could be blocked. Practice is a single skill. So again, if I need that person to stand up, well, maybe I just do rocking back and forth. Yeah, it's good. Is that going to get them to stand up? Probably not. But it'll get them to start to stand up. The only way it's going to get them to stand up is if they stand up. But maybe I need to do that. Maybe I need to teach that motor plan first. Rock forward, because what do we do when we stand up? Well, you got to bring yourself forward to get you up. Serial practice a group of motor skills in a predictable order. Random practice the skills in a random order. Variable practice with a variety of circumstances in order to increase generalizability. So standing, sit to stand. Do I just give them one chair? Do I change the surface? Do I dim the lights? Do I give them in a crowded environment? Again, these are all things that are going to help the patient. You just have to figure out what's going to be the best way. But I can certainly tell you, practicing in different environments is going to be helpful. Practicing on different surfaces is going to be helpful. They're not just going to stand from one chair in the PT lab, in the gym. They're going to have to get up from a couch. They're going to have to get up from the bed. They're going to have to get up from a dining room chair. Well, you know, you better practice different heights, different surfaces for that patient. That's that specificity. You want to get them up from one chair, get them up from the toilet. Hey, you're really good getting up from the toilet. That's great. but you can't get up from the couch. Well, you gotta work from getting up from the couch. It's all different. But you have to make sure you incorporate that stuff. Again, do we break the component down, or do we just do the component? Who knows? Feedback, knowledge of results. Identify success or failure at the end. Let them perform it. What do you think? How do you think you did? Well, I could have done this better. Okay, next time, concentrate, think about that, but try to do that better. Or do we do knowledge of performance? Give them feedback as they're performing it. Well, you try to bring your head forward, lean forward, push up with your hands, instead of coming straight up, because then your butt's going to want to go backwards. If you come up at an angle, then you want to go forward. That's what you want to do. Again, you try it each way. Play around with your patients and see how they respond to it. Maybe some will be better with making the errors and making their modifications. Maybe some need that cue throughout. So movement initiated. They get the sensory feedback. Hey, is that right? Does it feel right? Did I do it right? They detect the errors. You know what? I noticed I need to come forward a little more. I need to get my stomach firing. I need to get these muscles working. I need more range of motion. I don't say range of motion, but I think if I would have come forward more, it would have been better. They correct those errors, and finally comes to the completed task. So again, think about it. Starting tomorrow, your work with a patient, do I let them make the mistake? Or do I give them the cues throughout? Try each way and see. Nothing wrong. So again, motor control, direct posture, whatever. So putting it all together. So we need to improve, that's a summary. You can read the summary. It's just me talking about the same stuff over again. It's like, you want to hear me. So putting it all together. Improve impairments in the underlying systems. So I need to see, how's the range of motion, how's the flexibility, how's the neuromuscular control, how's the strength, how's the cardiovascular system. All that is going to dictate us learning these tasks. So improving the motor impairments, providing that sensory feedback, work on the balance, work on that postural control, work on, again, the tactile, work on the vision. Okay? Again, all that, incorporate that to be able to master the task. But also cognitive training, using a different motor strategy. How do I teach this person? How do I ensure that they're going to learn it? And then finally, change the environment that we're teaching it in. Like I said, it's great that somebody can walk 10 miles in the hospital, but yet let's get them outside and they have a hard time walking 10 feet to their front door. It's great that they're walking, but yet when they have to cross Market Street to get to Dinosaur Barbecue, they're getting run down by cars because we didn't work on any temporal parameters of gait. We just worked on that. I just cared, hey, I got them walking 500 feet independently.
But how's their cadence?
Exactly. I didn't do cadence, and so now the bus is coming. Well, you know what? In therapy, we're going to walk faster. I'm going to time you. Let's get across there. You got 20 feet here. You got to do it in 14 seconds, whatever it is. Work on that as well. Okay? Questions? So again, this is not going to be in any test, but use this as you move forward, as you become pretty damn good therapists. All right? How do I do? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? How do I ensure they're learning?